Welcome to another live edition of Blacklisted Radio. It's the third day of February 2014. My name is Doug Owen, and of course the website is blacklistedradio.com. Tonight, we are talking with Scott Horton. He is, of course, and most of you that listen to the podcast often realize that I don't do a lot of interviews. I only bring on people that are either A, hilarious, B, very intellectual, academic, and can teach us something, or C, people I admire. And I think that Scott actually fills B and C. I've been listening to his podcast, and I highly suggest that all of you... Oh,
come on, I'm hilarious, too.
You are hilarious. You are hilarious, but I think out of all three, you definitely deserve the B and C. And I love the delivery, right. Of course. It's very casual, and when you listen to the podcast, you'll realize that even though Scott might seem laid back, he really has a huge amount of information when it comes to foreign policy with a libertarian viewpoint, and I appreciate it and really do find your podcast to be invaluable.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it, and I'm sorry for interrupting.
No, no, absolutely. By the way, Scott is a journalist. He's also the host of Antiwar Radio, of course, the famous anti-radio or Antiwar.com. And the radio show, you can just find it right there at the top of the page, right there at his website as well at scotthorton.org. And he has, of course, the Scott Horton Show that's on Liberty Express Radio. So I brought Scott on to talk about the Iran sanctions. I think that that's a good starting point. I do want to talk about Syria and all of the international players and the external forces that are driving some of the foreign policy that's happening there. But I think that when we see Hillary Clinton coming out against the Iran sanctions, or at least dampening them, delaying them, everything that she is doing is the lead up to her campaign in 2016. So very, very well thought out, very well positioned, and very political. So when it comes to Iran, I think that there's this seeming policy shift that a lot of people are noticing. Just a few years ago, we really, they were the worst guys in the block. Now today we have French delegations talking about how wonderful it is to be doing business. So let's talk about the policy shift and what's driving that.
Well, first of all, I think you're right about Hillary Clinton. She waited, of course, until long after weeks, 2 weeks, more than 2 weeks, I think, after Harry Reid announced that he was going to not schedule a vote and that the bill in the Senate was pretty much dead. Rand Paul also waited until it was already dead to come out against him, for the same reasons, really. So they can both come out and say, oh no, I supported the president on that, because I think, as you're implying there, they're reading the tea leaves and they think that there's going to be a deal here. And they don't want to be on the bad side of it because they figure it is going to get done. And I think so too. And in fact, Philip Giraldi, who's a former CIA officer and writes for the American Conservative magazine, did a thing where he is hearing from his CIA friends that they were actually there. The analysts came to Oman, where they were with William Burns and the kind of, secret negotiations behind the scenes while they were working out this deal. And how, basically they brought all these, I guess math whizzes or whoever from CIA who basically gamed it all out, that we would be willing to settle for this, this, and this, because that would put them off, that would make their breakout capability so weak that they would only be able to achieve, this by this amount of time or whatever, with no intervention. So, in other words, while the ambassador was working the deal, he had people working out the details and making sure that it would be acceptable during, in real time during the negotiations and that kind of thing, and that they really solved it. And that really even the space between the interim deal and even maybe the original thing where they had to wait a few weeks because the French had objected to a little bit of the language and this and that, how basically that was all for show for the Israelis, that, oh yeah, we're being real hard on them, but ultimately, behind the scenes, they have a real agreement as to what the final deal is going to look like. I mean, it's not signed yet, but it seems like it should be a done deal. And the question of why the redirection in policy there, I don't know if I want to ascribe too much purpose to the flailings of our empire at this point. I mean, basically what happened was Bush believed the neocons, And the neocons believed Ahmed Chalabi. And Ahmed Chalabi had told the neocons that what's going to happen if you get a regime change against Saddam Hussein is you'll get a Hashemite king like in Jordan. And the Shia will go along with it, and the Sunnis will go along with it, and everybody will go along with it, and they'll be compliant to our wishes, like the king of Jordan. And, of course, the whole thing was a screw job, and the Iraqi National Congress was headquartered in Tehran. You would think that Richard Pearl might have caught on to that. Hey, how come your headquarters is in Tehran, dude? But anyway,
right.
So Ahmed Chalabi fooled these Americans into lying us into war to overthrow Iran's enemy, and they ended up inheriting, and I really do think that was just a stupid blunder on their part, of their, complete misunderstanding of what the results were going to be. And then they ended up fighting a 8-year war to give the Shiite Arabs control of Baghdad, and that whole war was fought on behalf of the Iranians' interests, if not, directly for the Iranians. It did everything to shore them up, and then it was back in, 2007, I think, when Seymour Hersh came out with this piece in the New Yorker, The Redirection, where basically like Bull Shannon on Night Court slapping himself in the head, oops, I guess I screwed up, let's go back to our Saudis first policy and start back on the Sunnis again. And then, this is all good for the Israelis, because the Israelis are the most terrified of Iran. They don't care about, America's enemies in Al-Qaeda, the ones that actually are enemies, which that may be a different discussion. But anyway, they don't care about that. They care about Hezbollah, and they care about Syria, and they're both backed by Iran. So, in other words, they added Iraq accidentally to the Shiite crescent, mostly controlled by Iran, in which Iran is the dominant force. And so on one hand, they're trying to weaken Assad, or maybe even take out Assad and get a regime change in Syria, which would weaken Iran's power that way. But it seems like possibly wiser arguments are prevailing on the other hand, saying that, if we were to get over the Cold War with Iran and make a deal with them, then maybe we wouldn't be so beholden to the Saudis so much anymore. And maybe we could end up, taking the support out from under Hezbollah and Syria, which is Israel's problem in the first place, so everybody wins. And, any American idiot knows better than the Israeli government what's good for Israel. So, you know what I mean? It seems like a pretty good deal if you let, American State Department weenies who actually understand the region and sort of kind of mean well to let them do this. It seems like it really could lead to great benefits. Some of the, at least some factions out of Saudi Arabia were saying, hey, if you want to do this, we're with you. We're your friends, and we know that you know what to do. And if you want to, warm up to and open up to Iran and do this nuclear deal, then let's do this. So that's not perfect, but it's an opportunity. It really is an opportunity for peace. It's, the very best thing about the Obama years so far, for sure. That's not a done deal yet. I don't want to oversell it, but, I don't see any reason. Oh, let me say one more thing about this. There's no reason to not do the Iran deal at all. No reason at all that anyone could articulate whatsoever. There's just no reason not to do it, because it's a big fake issue in the first place. They're not building nuclear weapons. They have no strategy that says, yeah, it would be a good idea to build a nuclear weapon. They made no decision to make a nuclear weapon. The IAEA has verified all along that they're not making nuclear weapons. So in essence, anything that we got to give them on our side is no big deal to get them to keep doing what they're already doing, which is making electricity, enriching uranium to industrial grade. And really, this is just a way, this is like a face-saving way for the Americans to stop bloviating about a fake nuclear weapons program that doesn't really exist. This is a way for them to say that, okay, now we're satisfied that you're really not making nukes. We're extra double satisfied you're not making nukes. And so, because, of course, that's been the official government position of the U.S. since 2007. So now we're extra double sure you're not making nukes, so, okay, now we can stop threatening you, basically. There's no reason not to do this.
So most of that's domestic propaganda,
this is the key to the end of the Cold War.
Well, what I was saying is that most of that's domestic propaganda, isn't it, though? That the big bad Iranians are going to, wipe Israel off the map, and that's why it's okay to sell the Saudis $80 billion worth of weapons, and they can transfer that to friends and allies in Syria. It gives us a reason to have this external threat that justifies. In 2012, spending or actually selling the world, not just the U.S., but in the aggregate, $395 billion worth of weapons. So you have to have a boogeyman. You have to have a bad guy, don't you?
I don't know, man. I mean, honestly, if the rest of the world didn't exist, they would just pretend that, the aliens are coming or something. And there's always China. You can endlessly build up against them, and they have nukes and can shoot back with them. And so you can't really get into a war with them, but you can sort of pretend and do a big sort of peacetime Reaganite era build up sort of thing if you want. I think, part of this reflects, too, differences of opinions among the establishment. I mean, certainly the neoconservatives and most of the right-wing nationalists are against this. This is more an initiative of the, center-left, Democrat, realist types, and the more older George H.W. Bush types. Kissinger and Baker and all those old school criminals, they're all for this thing.
Right.
They all are saying enough is enough with the Iran deal, with the Iran Cold War. So, I don't know. I mean, I guess if they want, they could just pick a fight with India or somebody, if they want to. But I think that, there are certainly some people in the administration, and I guess in this case that Obama has gone ahead and given the green light to them to go ahead and get this done, who they prefer to, I won't say really pivot away from the Middle East, but a little bit they have to come to terms with, their actual station in the Middle East, which is they really can't just threaten everybody and try to intimidate them into doing whatever they want and have everything just the way they want like the old days. I mean, things really are in flux, and the best they can do is try and do a lousy job, but I think they kind of recognize that too. And, I don't know. It could be also that there are very specific lobbyists representing very specific companies that would like to do very specific deals with Iran, and they happen to know just the right senators or something like that. I mean, there's a lot to politics that's certainly the way it works, right? It's coalitions of interests coming together for certain policies.
Iran doesn't have a central bank. They've got lots of oil. They've got lots of money. There's lots of opportunity there. So if you look at maybe that policy shift and the power shift that you're mentioning with AIPAC and with the neocons, I think that is happening as well. I don't know if it's a misnomer, but I think it's an oversimplification that I see all the time. And I'm sure you, come across this often. And that is that Israel controls the Congress, the Senate, our foreign policy. They are steering all of these wars, or at least are the majority controlling driving force behind that. And they point to, these very powerful lobbies that spend millions and millions of our own dollars back here, with, politicians in tow. So, I mean, how much of that is true, and how much of that is there a shift away from that, or do you think this is really just kind of a realization that there's just only so many things that we can really ultimately do in the Middle East, and maybe it's time to, get on board and make some money?
Yeah. I guess I would say the oversimplification grew up when it was more true than it is now. The famous quote from Steve Rosen, who was indicted for espionage, but then they let him go. They basically, rigged all the pretrial hearings. He won every pretrial hearing to the degree where he was unprosecutable anymore, and they had to drop the charges. But he was the political director for AIPAC for a long, long time, and he bragged to Jeffrey Goldberg back in, this would have been in the late 90s or maybe 2001 or something, 2002, that you see this napkin? They're at the hotel bar. You see this napkin? By this time tomorrow, I could have the signature of 77 senators on this napkin, meaning it doesn't matter what it is. They'll do what they're told. And the truth of the matter is, the Israel lobby is extremely well organized, extremely effective, and they have a very powerful alliance with the Christian Zionists on the right. In fact, just in the past, I just read a story. They tweeted it. The Christians United for Israel tweeted out. And it was a story about their numbers. 10,000 members of Christians United for Israel had spent a week calling and sending letters and emails and lobbying Congress for the sanctions and against the president. And so I think, the politics were not necessarily with them this time, but that's the kind of pressure that they can bring to bear, and it is extremely powerful. And you know what it is too? They're consistent. So if a congressman crosses them, that's it. We're going to support whoever is in the primaries against you, no matter what. And we're going to support whoever runs against you in the general, no matter what. And we won't support you at all. And if you win anyway, we'll see it in 2 years, pal. And and hey, that's the game. That's the political game in American democracy. I'm just saying, they play it really well. And of course, the richer somebody is, the more right-wing he is. So even very rich Democratic Jewish donors tend to side with the Likud party policies in Israel and tend to push for a very hard line. And so you can see oftentimes a lot of pressure on, just look at Chuck Schumer basically represents exactly, what they want out of him. And you might even remember when Wesley Clark was talking about running for president back in whenever it was. I guess this would have been in '04. He said, well, it's really hard when you take a controversial position in the Middle East because the New York money people will get you. And they were like, oh, you're a Nazi for saying money people. That's code word for Jews or something like that.
Right.
And in a sense, it sort of was, but he didn't mean it like a code word. He meant it like he was trying to say it very artfully and carefully, but it was just actually the truth that, hey, you know who funds more than 50% of the costs of the American Democratic Party? Rich Jews from New York. That's who pays for the existence of the Democratic Party. And the richer you are, the more right-wing you are. So they have a very, hard line on a lot of this stuff. Now, when the Israel lobby and American foreign policy came out in, 2006, something like that, oh, man, there was a hue and cry that two Gentiles dared to say that there is a new, very powerful Jewish establishment in Washington, D.C. that has a lot of influence, and we ought to be able to talk about it without being called Holocaust deniers or anything like that. And it does have a lot of power, and it was a significant, if not the significant force in getting us into war with Iraq and to this day, our policies on Iraq and Iran and Syria and the rest of the Middle East. And so, but now the thing is, they tried to smear Walton and Mearsheimer, but they clearly they're the authors of that, the Israel Lobby book. But they clearly were just not hateful, anti-Semitic men at all. They're just, intellectuals, and this is their business, and so they wrote about it. They're from the realist faction, which is, maybe the old, Waspier type guys or whatever. But I think that basically the accusation that you're an anti-Semite to understand this or to talk about this or to question what are all of Paul Wolfowitz's motivations when he goes to work in the morning or something like that, is that's some kind of hate crime or whatever. I think that smear's fallen away, and people don't really believe that anymore. And I think as a consequence, the Israel lobby's power is greatly diminished. It's sort of, I'm sorry, there's probably like a fairy tale or something that should be a good analogy here, where once somebody finally says, oh, like the emperor wears no clothes, there you go. Somebody finally says, hey, there's an Israel lobby, and it has a lot of undue influence, and they're bad on everything, and so, hey, let's talk about this. And once people started talking about it, they started talking about, yeah, they do seem to agree with Benjamin Netanyahu about everything, and he's bad on everything. And so, and then their power is greatly diminished because, as David Petraeus put it and as General Mattis both put it in sworn testimony, that this costs American soldiers' lives over there. This costs American security, not that America should have an empire in the region anyway, but this causes a lot of animus against the United States before September 11th, during, and after. American support for Israel, and no matter what their policy is, and even getting rid of Saddam Hussein, not so much just because of Bush-Cheney reasons, but because of Ariel Sharon, Benjamin Netanyahu reasons, as the neocons had written in their study, A Clean Break and Coping with Crumbling States back in 1996. The way to weaken Hezbollah is to weaken Syria and to weaken Iran. And the way to do that is regime change in Iraq. Now, why they thought that was true is beyond me. If you read what they wrote, you'll think that they're got to be the dumbest neocons in the whole wide world. But there you have it.
Well, they know how to work a crutch. You look at Obama's policies, regardless of what you think of him. If you criticize him, many are quick to point out that you're a racist. You don't like him because he's black. You happen to be white. So it's that same kind of obfuscation that works really well in politics. And I think that the Israeli lobby, has been able to do that quite well.
Well, and also, part of it is that Jewishness has something to do with it, right? It would be like if the Congressional Black Caucus was just obsessed with what goes on in Mozambique all the time, but you're not allowed to point out that, for whatever reason they got, I don't know, business ties back in Mozambique or whatever it is, or there's some ancient conflict they're fighting over there or whatever. The truth is that has something to do with what we're talking about here, but it doesn't have to devolve into some caricature or some, collective accusation against, unnamed faithless people for doing something wrong. It's just that, as Walt and Mearsheimer put it, accepting the American system as it is, there's really nothing illegitimate about the Israel lobby at all. I mean, you could say they should have to register as foreign agents or whatever, but they're more or less open and honest about what it is that they want and why it is that they want it. And so, it's really up to the Peace Party to do better, honestly. I mean, that's the political game as far as it goes.
Yeah. You have to vote with your dollars, with your mind, and with your ballot. And quite frankly, I think that if you continue to buy into these ridiculous notions and in the security theater and all of this media propaganda, at some point, I don't know, I guess there's no one else to blame for conning you into this. I mean, we've seen war, and I think that that's where a lot of people are at right now, Scott. We've seen this over and over again. Oh, the fear, the security, threats, and, this idea of a terrorist threat that's always looming, that we have to be ever vigilant. I think that the American people, and not just people in this country, but around the world, are kind of at their wits' end, and they've seen war for such a long time now, pretty much endlessly. And just to turn to Iraq real quickly, you look at what has come out of U.S. foreign policy, and I mean, things are completely degrading. They're bombing Fallujah. I mean, if you look at what's happened there, the devastation, I mean, it's a testament to really, really bad foreign policy. And I think that we can lay a lot of it, if not the majority of it, on Israel's feet. Although, we're accomplices in this because we gave it our blessing collectively here in this country, if you will.
Sure. Yeah, no, I mean, it was the American government that took us to war, don't get me wrong, but
right.
It was the neocons who made it possible. It's kind of, maybe it's hard to remember the context back then, but there was not a consensus in all of New York and D.C. that this had to be done. It was led by the White House, first and foremost, but the neocons in and outside of the government, and really especially in the media, where there's, one neocon on every editorial board in America somehow, and they just create this echo chamber, and on Fox News too, where just everyone knows. They just created an instant consensus, the neoconservatives did, with their echo chamber, and they really made it possible. I mean, even on the eve of war, half the country knew better, right? Half the country knew better, even on the eve of war, after a year of being propagandized about how bad
Dick Cheney knew better.
Done.
I mean, he thought that what was going to happen was he was going to see Panama 2.0. It was going to be quick, bang, throw the government out, and before you know it, you have a friendly dictator. He had done it with his good buddy Don Rumsfeld and the whole neocon crew, and they thought, well, it's time to take on the Middle East. That's the next obvious step, and we've tested out all of these really cool laser weapons and all sorts of neat stuff in Panama, and they just basically took that and patently tried to use it again, and ultimately, Dick Cheney knew that it was going to fail. I mean, he himself said that, we didn't take out Saddam because what comes after, and I paraphrase, but the political vacuum. I mean, who's going to rule over this, unless you have a central government in place, and we can't do that. So when they came back, it was for total devastation, and they knew that, and policymakers and the wonks and the big thinkers had looked at this on paper, and they knew what was going to happen.
Well, and that's not to say that, the Shia of Iraq should have had to suffer under Saddam and his minority tyranny forever, but it just wasn't on us to change that. And in fact, I interviewed a guy, and of course, it's not like the Americans were doing it for the Shiites, because of, some altruistic influence anyway. But I interviewed a guy recently, I'm trying to remember his name, I'm sorry, but he had written all about the first Gulf War and the Big Bay of Pigs disaster in the desert in '91 when Bush Sr. had encouraged all the Shiites and Kurds to rise up and overthrow Saddam, and then had left them high and dry and left Saddam with his attack helicopters to take him out. And the thing of it was, as this guy pointed out, that if they had just, grounded the helicopters, and in fact, he talked about how the Americans themselves basically helped Saddam pen the Shiites in and prevent them from marching to the capital, landed helicopters on the highways and prevented them from marching on Baghdad, even army divisions that were turning on Saddam, and they were all taken out. And the thing of it is, there probably would have been a civil war at that point if they had just, let it go. But what they ended up doing was, basically they left Saddam with the ability, and basically really helped him crush the insurgency. So then, when finally they came in to do the right thing, and under Paul Wolfowitz's view, and let the Shiites take over, well, they completely abolished the entire Iraqi state. So it wasn't like they just put new people in charge. They completely abolished the army, completely abolished all Ba'ath Party members from any position in the state whatsoever. And so basically there had to be an entire war to create a new government there, and for the Shiites to push all the Sunni Arabs out of Baghdad. And so where it's now an 85% Shiite city and all this, whereas if this had happened back in '91, there would have been it's much more likely anyway that there would have been some kind of compromise over there, rather than, 1 million people killed. I guess it's impossible to say exactly, but for them to basically change their mind back to Saddam in the middle of the uprising, well, that's, just as unforgivable as backing Saddam in the first place, or then turning around and invading and killing 1 million people to get rid of them. I mean, this whole thing is crazy. Can you imagine America, the most powerful state in the history of the world, picking on crappy little Iraq for 30 years in a row? I mean, what is this? How in the world could Iraq be our enemy? After taking out the German Nazis and the Soviet communists, our enemy is the people of Iraq? And this just, I don't know. The whole thing is just crazy. I think everybody knows now it's crazy.
Well, I think so, yeah. That's the change. That's the shift. And I think it's really important to look at, the fruits of these wars, and how rotten they are, and not to mention the financial boondoggle, where we're at today, where we could be, in the amount of, I think, blood on the American government's hands. And, it's just like so many of these other things. I mean, if you turn a blind eye to crime on Wall Street, you're going to have criminal bankers that are above the law, that are beyond prosecution. And that's what we have with the war state. And I think that, the more and more people are looking at this objectively, the more and more people are, fed up in a lot of different ways. I think for me, it's just morally reprehensible, and the fact that even the most well-intentioned people that were behind some of these, half-cocked plots, even if there were well intentions, we should, realize by now that our intervention is not helping. And, a lot of these situations, I mean, you're kind of damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. It's not very black and white. And real quickly here, I know we're running out of time. I just want to briefly talk about Syria, because that seems like a pretty, not black and white situation, especially with Russia in the background, and, the tension between the U.S. and Russia that has really, I think, arisen, or at least become more high profile in the media over the last year. So can you talk about Syria, some of the big players from Saudi Arabia to Russia, even China, and why that seems to be a culmination point where there's so many external state and corporate actors?
Well, I think that the Russians figured that the Americans jumped the gun. Obama, with his thing back in 2011, he said, Assad must step aside. He had no ability to really carry that out. And what the Russians have basically done is
red line
bluff, and they figure that, this will be basically, if this isn't the high tide of American influence in the Middle East, it's marking the receding of the tide, really, from Iraq. Pat Buchanan wrote that Fallujah '04, when they successfully resisted the assault of November '04. That's the high tide of the American empire right there. I think that's pretty much right, and I think that the Russians backing Syria, because, you know, their interest, people debate about this, but people I trust, like Eric Margulies, I think, said, yeah, you know, the sea base there in Syria isn't that big of a deal to them. It's more of a symbolic thing. But I think that the Russians have just decided it's smart to basically, and in fact they have already successfully called America's bluff. And in fact, Hillary Mann Leverett and Flint Leverett at Going to Tehran, they wrote that once Obama was forced by the American people, and really I think by the Pentagon, to back down from his threat to attack Syria last summer, that, well, that was it. Now he can't really credibly threaten to attack Iran, because the American people don't want war with Iran any more than they want war with Syria, and they already proved, and as anyone could guess in a moment, a war with Iran would be a much bigger deal, with much greater consequences and a much greater commitment than any war with Syria, a minuscule pinprick or whatever, like John Kerry said. So, you know, I think that basically this is part of why they basically, you know, had to go ahead and seek the deal, is that their bluff has been called successfully by Putin in Syria. And after all, I mean, put yourself in Obama's shoes here for a minute. No matter what McCain is barking about, do you really want to be the president who helped Al-Qaeda win in Syria? Because that's who's fighting on the so-called rebel side in Syria. Now, he can't come out in favor of the Ba'athist dictator like George W. Bush paid him to torture people all day back in the Bush years. But Obama can't do that. He never should have said that Assad must step down because he has no ability to enforce it. But I think that he would just rather let this be Jeb's problem or Hillary's problem about what's going to be the end game in Damascus. Because if the Ba'athist government there were to fall, which it's not about to, and the real measure of that is whatever Patrick Coburn thinks, by the way. You know, assuming that they could ever get their regime change in Damascus, then now what are you going to do with the Islamic State of Iraq, which is just Zarqawi's group, the Al-Qaeda suicide bomber prisoner beheaders, and, you know, the Al-Nusra Front are just the same as them. So, you know, there are, in Iraq, Al-Qaeda was the tiniest percentage of the Iraqi nationalist Sunni insurgency, the Sunni tribes fighting. They were always 3-5%, whatever. But in Syria, they are the insurgency. There's no insurgency except the Al-Qaeda guys. And yeah, they are backed by the Saudis, the Americans, the Saudis, the Qataris, the Turks, and the Jordanians too, to I guess a lesser degree. Some training has gone on in their territory. They've all been chipping in on the side of the revolutionary, so-called, the insurgency since 2011. And, you know, there was minor discrepancies between who the Qataris favored versus who the Saudis favored or whatever, but ultimately this is where the Al-Nusra Front and the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria are getting their guns and getting their money. And so, I mean, man, it's a mess.
Yeah, I mean, how much...
Maybe there's not something to do. You're right. Stop intervening and don't do a thing. And you know what? If the Russians want to take responsibility for it, let them. That's my policy.
Yeah, well, I think that cooler heads usually prevail, and if you look at most of the really horrible, rash decisions that were made post September 11, 2001, you can really say that it was ego when it came to Obama. I would say the same with George W. Bush and the neocon policymakers. I think it's a lot more about saving face and justifying these huge, insane budgets that have, I mean, we're talking about trillions of dollars that they've, put into war. And there's really not a lot to show for it.
Like that on Antiwar.com today, by the way, about the military-industrial complex and the war on terrorism. It's really good.
Yeah, well, can you summate a little bit?
I'm sorry?
Can you summate a little bit? Give him a teaser?
He talks about how, boy, oh boy, here we are after all these years, and the Director of National Intelligence says that there's more Al-Qaeda crawling around than ever before. So we can see why he wants us to think that, so we need him. Because otherwise, why would we need him, and why would we let him tramp all over our rights? And then there's the question about whether it's even really true, and I think he more or less decides that, yeah, it kind of looks like it is, but so maybe we shouldn't be bankrolling them in Syria right now, and maybe we shouldn't have invaded Iraq back then, just like I told you.
Yeah.
That's pretty much it. It's at original.antiwar.com/Paul.
Okay, great. Yeah. You were talking about cleaning up the mess. Maybe it won't be the Russians. Maybe it'll be Eric Prince. I hear that he's working for the Africans and the Chinese and even in Iraq. So a lot of it's being privatized. I think that's really important, but it's a whole nother chapter that we should definitely talk about in the future. I really appreciate the time, Scott. Thanks so much for being on Blacklisted Radio. Throw out the
Thanks
website.
very much for having me. I'm sorry I went on so long.
No. I could talk for 2-3 hours. I love geopolitics and foreign policy. I find it to be so revealing because when you look at the macro, it explains what's happening in the micro and maybe vice versa. But when you look at bad foreign policy, you realize why things are kind of screwed up here in the good old US of A. It's these kind of, whack-a-mole solutions to all of the world's problems, whether it's war, society. Sure. We could cure everything with a pill kind of mentality. And that's really what I see it as being. That's a great parallel. It's like, we'll just take a few $1 billion and we'll get a bunch of Scud missiles and we'll give those there. And then we'll get some Patriot missiles. We'll have a war and we'll make a lot of money. And, everybody's going to be happy at the end of this and we'll hail it as freedom. It's just that kind of, crazy short-term thinking that has brought just devastation to this world. And that's why I'm glad there's people like Scott out here doing a lot of great work and the people at antiwar.com for continuing to do this. Even though it's not popular right now with a Democratic president to be anti-war, you guys have always stayed true to that. And I do appreciate it. Throw out the websites and let people know where they can listen to more Scott Horton.
Well, my website is scotthorton.org. I keep all my interview archives there and all that. And I'm on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube at /Scott Horton Show.
All right. Until next time. Thanks, Scott.
Thank you very much, Doug. Appreciate it.